Hi everyone, I'm here with Hemant Patel, who's the CEO and founder of Anumana, and they're in the data analytics space. So Hemant, thanks very much for joining me. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris, for inviting me.
So as I say, you're in the data analytics space. That space just seems to be burgeoning over the last sort of 5 years with data expanding hugely, analytical techniques being put to play in ever more detail. What are some of the trends that you've been seeing? I mean, no doubt you've been keeping pretty busy,
Yeah.
but what are some of the trends you've been seeing in terms of like this sort of transformation that's happened over the last sort of like 5 years or so?
It's really interesting because the technology and the techniques have been around for a long time.
Mm,
You've got industries like financial industries, particularly investment banking, that were well ahead of the game. Then debt purchase was probably a leader when it comes to data and
mm,
analytics compared to other industries. Now, as I've moved out of the debt purchase industry into other verticals, I've seen sort of quite a lag in the
mm,
capabilities, particularly sort of across the e-commerce space. We've been in utilities, but what we're finding is because technology in itself, the infrastructure has advanced so quickly over the last few years with ChatGPT, with Midjourney, with the generative AI modules and applications that are coming out. It's really bringing into the mainstream what technology can now do to enable advanced analytics, which is where the conversation is becoming more prevalent.
So what's changed? What you're saying is, I agree with that. So some of the analytical techniques have been around since the
Yeah,
1970s to a certain extent, at least
yeah,
mathematically, right?
yeah,
But it's
absolutely.
almost like is it just the cheapness of processing power and then that gives us just wider accessibility? So almost like the finance groups had the money to be able to invest in it because it was decision making and there was the return there. But now it's just the low cost of the infrastructure means it's just accessible to a much wider kind of group, and we're getting fintechs basically developing it, new techniques, new kind of software to help us use it.
Exactly that. I think the actual analytical techniques that are being applied aren't as innovative
Mm,
as the technology that it sits upon. That the
mm,
technology is brought it a lot closer to home. It's accessible, irrespective of what your own machine is.
mm,
You're just with cloud infrastructure, the ability to use cutting edge processing power, cutting edge machines. It is available at fingertips to individuals, which then means that it's a far less or far more reduced cost to really get to the cutting edge. Obviously 10, 15, 20 years ago, you need to invest in big machines. The infrastructure itself was the limiting factor. But now with engineering techniques, with different processing power, with cloud technology, it's all there to enable cutting edge analytics. And now we can really move the dial on, well, what does that mean
mm.
with the limitations there?
What's been the impact of things like, I suppose you've got, remember the Internet of Things that used to be out there,
Yeah,
which was really around gathering data almost like
yeah.
at a much more granular level. What's been the impact of that? And I suppose in just our digital infrastructure in terms of measuring much more, because it also feels, yes, the infrastructure's changed, but also the amount of data we have access to, because we're recording things digitally, seems to be way bigger than than it ever was before. It's almost like it's built on top of all of these different technologies to get us where we are today.
Absolutely. We've had concepts of big data for a long time now, but we're now in a phase where you don't have to be a real expert when it comes to
Mm,
decision science and data analytics to interrogate large realms of data or
mm,
even broad varieties of data. We're now looking at utilizing the technology itself rather than the techniques to be able to really go into deep data mining
mm.
techniques. And that gives a lot more access to businesses and individuals to be able to really compile big data sets for the purpose of generating value for the businesses.
And I suppose from a data science point of view, and I leave large language models to one side for now, but just talking about regular sort of machine learning, AI, and the
Mm.
different kind of like modeling techniques that there are. Is it? I know there's different versions you can use, but does it still? There must be like that human element involved in terms of spending a lot of your time around what is the business problem and trying to solve for, and then getting the data to solve for that. Does that constitute a lot of like the day job still for most data scientists?
100%. For me, as I've built data analytics teams over
Mm.
a long time frame, the difference between a good data analyst and a great data analyst was almost an art rather than
Mm.
science.
Yeah.
You could have someone who was highly technically capable, but if they couldn't understand the language of the business and understand how to interpret and ask the right sorts of questions, then
Mm.
they were never going to come up with the great data analytics
Mm.
outputs. So that still remains the same. That's still important now more than ever because you've got that quicker access to the end
Mm.
product, which is now available. So with every project we do, it all starts at the same point. What are we trying to solve for? What
Mm.
ultimately is the business value? Data analytics is a tool. It's not a product. It's not
Mm.
an output. It's a tool to get you to a product and output.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you've got to understand what is it in for the business, what you're trying to achieve.
But in terms of efficiency around data science, you've got the what is the business problem? You've also got cleansing the data and making sure the data then
Yeah.
becomes applicable and those kind of things. Is that data cleanse probably the area where there's probably more efficiencies to do it automatically versus that? Because it still sounds like there still needs to be that human kind of interaction. That piece is going to be difficult to automate and push away, but there's probably efficiencies to be gained around the data interpretation piece, which can then give you the outputs.
Yeah, I think from the start to the finish, there is an overarching framework that you
Mm.
apply, and in each parts of that framework, there is an opportunity for increasing the efficiency for automating. I don't think there are any parts of the framework that you can that are protected from
Mm.
automation, but there is always going to be an element of human nature to extract that extra element of value. I think
Mm.
what's becoming really important now is the concept that data and analytics is a symbiotic process. Previously, when I've been in organizations, data and analytics stepped separately. They're in
Mm.
silos, and a lot of businesses are starting to understand that the role of the CDO is one that covers a larger space. You can't have analytics reporting into finance and
Mm.
data reporting into to IT and technology. You need to have someone at the center managing the whole process, and that enables you to understand how engineering can enable analytics, and analytics can create the requirements for engineering, and they've got to work seamlessly together.
Yeah. I was on a call the other day, one of the conferences the other day, and we were talking a little bit about what does a process look like. So we used to think very much in terms of this is the process and moving linearly A to B to C to D, whatever it is.
Yeah,
And it's almost like the data would then just fall out of that. We would just observe the data through the process on the outside. At what point are we going to turn it around and say, actually, it is about the data, and you design the process around gathering the data throughout the process, and then the data allows you to then get better. So rather than it being in our mind in the real world, we think about the process or the report or the output rather than how do we design the data that can then give us the output. Do you think we're ever going to switch that round and become way more data centric, even in terms of like process design, even in terms of agent conversations? Example is like, what data are we gathering and what does that tell us?
yeah,
And then we can use that for then a lot of other things. And it really is about the data, not the process to a certain extent.
absolutely. And we're seeing that now with some
Mm.
organizations that aren't data and analytics mature
Mm.
from a capabilities perspective, but from a cultural and a from a cultural perspective, they are mature. They are thinking about that
Mm.
end objective. They're not just thinking about how do I get a report or how do I answer a specific question. They're thinking
Mm.
about, well, actually, how do I generate business value from data? And a lot of that comes from, well, what data do we have and what data do we need?
Yeah.
And how do we go about understanding what that end objective is so that we can start collating that data earlier on and giving ourselves that richness in the future, because it isn't an overnight process. It's an investment of
Mm.
time as well as money, and the sooner you start, the more value you're going to get over
Yeah.
the long
And,
term.
there's some industries that are further ahead than others. You mentioned financial services versus retail as an
Yeah,
example, but even within that and subsegments within that, who's doing this stuff really well versus, I suppose, less to a certain extent? But who would you point to saying, look, these industries are really doing it really well, or these areas of industries are really doing it well?
I think I saw a stat about the percentage of FTSE 500 companies that have a CDO in place. And I think that was a perfect metric to demonstrate which industries are doing it. And
Yeah.
in banking and insurance,
Yeah.
CEOs were in 50% plus of industries. In retail, it was below 20%. And I think that's a perfect metric there to demonstrate exactly which industries are out of the game and which aren't. That doesn't mean to say that within those industries there aren't businesses that are really advanced and pushing on really the periphery of analytical and technological capabilities ahead of other verticals. But certainly as a collective, there are, I'd say, retail, utilities are industries that are coming into that space now.
Yeah. And what about large language models? Because are they really new? Is this something new that's coming along? What's your kind of view on them? When I use them as a consumer, they seem like magic. But I mean, as a data scientist, what's your kind of professional opinion?
Personally, if I'm honest, I wouldn't call myself a data scientist. There are a lot of other people that are much more capable than me with data science in particular. But from my experience, I think this is really where technology has enabled the mainstream use of large language models. The techniques have been there for a long time. It's just, as I said at the start, it's been able to bring that to the consumer. That's only really been the last few years that's moved the dial forward. And now innovation is just strife at the moment. There's just so much out there. God knows what's going to come out in the next week, let alone the next couple of years. It's great to be in a position where we've really got to push boundaries of innovation now, because the technology is becoming less of a limitation for us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is now. The techniques aren't new. The technologies are enabling it, but now the techniques are becoming more prevalent for individuals.
I mean, what I find particularly interesting is how you can almost take like weaker signals, but a lot more signals to then combine that to look at patterns to come out with an output, a bit like we do with language, right? So you have, or even if you observe something, you've got all these like inputs coming in, you've got a massive inputs, and it's the how do you observe that to then come out with something. So for example, one of the examples was being talked about, can you use these techniques to look at brain science as an example, because there's so much that we can't comprehend it to understand what's really going on, but maybe we can use the computer to help us to understand that. Do you think there's applicability for those kind of techniques in retail, as an example, or even financial services?
Yeah, I think, and I guess this comes back to the Anumana business model that is predicated on a belief that I have that businesses now have the opportunity at a much smaller level to develop their own proprietary AI solution. And when you have that ability to develop your own proprietary AI solution, you can solve your specific business problem, which gives you the opportunity of solving problems that were previously impossible or thought to be improbable. And that opens up a real expanse of opportunity that, for me, I don't really see a business problem as being the limiting factor in whether you can apply AI. I think it's really understanding the data space and the value in investing in AI to solve a specific business problem. So if the scale is there, then we're going to be seeing machine learning and applied to many different business problems that previously weren't looked at.
And it's interesting, how much of a threat do you think it is to large businesses, the fact that small businesses will be able to compete almost like on a much more sort of level playing field, and certainly in terms of cost efficiencies? So one of the interesting things you can use it to generate cost efficiencies, because you don't have to employ an army of people to do it. You can do it at a much smaller scale, and so that cost efficiency size of business goes away to a certain extent, which makes smaller businesses maybe more competitive. Do you think that's a threat to much larger businesses?
Yes and no. I think yes, in the fact that it does give smaller businesses the opportunity to scale incredibly quick, a lot quicker than previously. Human capital is no longer necessarily a limitation for growing a business, which has always been the case. However, with larger businesses, as long as they remain ahead of the game and they've got the capital to start off with, or in theory, they should have the capital to invest in innovation, in analytics, and keep that competitive advantage. So I think that for me, I think it allows smaller businesses to become successful a lot quicker.
Mm-hmm.
I think it allows them to establish themselves and create market presence.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they then can compete with other organizations and larger organizations, at the end of the day, the biggest challenge to smaller business is going to be the wealth of data available
Yeah.
to them. That's something that they, unless they're acquisitive, unless they find alternative data sources, that's something they really can't compete with large organizations on. But they can be agile, they can be nimble, and they
Yeah.
can be innovative, which could give us that
A-
edge.
And I suppose I said that sort of thinking about businesses in financial services, which tend to be very data driven rather
Yeah,
than retail, as an example. You might have actually retail stores as an example. So there's of a physical plant,
yeah,
right? Which is that still doesn't go away, right? So as much as
no.
we talk about data and these conceptual business models, the physicality of businesses sometimes just doesn't go away. It's like transport, logistics, those kind of things.
Yeah, there's so much technology available that
Mm,
actually there is. We're looking at computer vision as a technique that's enabling small businesses to understand how their uh, how how consumers are moving around their store, to be able to
mm,
understand the best opportunity of placement, product placement that's available at a really small scale as well as a large scale. I think in my experience at the moment, I'm seeing that I believe that over 90% of businesses are data and analytics illiterate and are
yeah.
technology naive. So I think there is a huge space for creating competitive advantage by just starting that early adoption.
So what about software programs for doing some of the analytics, right? So that's been a bit of a burgeoning market. That SAS
Mm.
was one that used to be way back. There's the R's come in. I know that you do stuff with Python as well, which just feels like that's kind of like taking over to a certain extent. What's your view on packages for doing some of the analysis and what works, what doesn't, and where do you think it's going to go?
I think people can get obsessed by learning multiple different programming
Mm,
languages and it becomes a tick box exercise. Say that I know R, Python, JSON, Erlang, etc. And at one point, you can think, what's the purpose of it?
yeah,
At the end of the day, for me, I think Python's the most popular language in the world. I personally haven't learnt it yet. I
yeah,
rely on my team to utilize it, but for individuals looking to enter the data analytics market, I think it gives enough accessibility to elements of engineering, elements of software programming, elements of analytics that it's a really good entry point there, and you can do pretty much anything that you really need to do within it. There will always be new programs, new languages coming to market. Obviously, there are a lot of people that are trying to come with no-code platforms to make programming more accessible to
mm,
technology literate people. So there's lots of different options, but I think for me, creating a solid foundation in one core programming language and creating a market that is encouraging more people to start utilizing it, even if it's at a small end of the spectrum, even if you're not a data analytics person, I think is going to become important. And I think personally, it's my belief that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see a programming language, probably Python, becoming an option for children
yeah.
alongside an actual spoken language.
Yeah, and I know we're going to chat a bit about the Code Academy that you've got as well, which sort of helps, I think, disadvantaged children around like
Yeah,
helping them code and particularly in Python, I think, is where
yeah.
you're kind of at the moment. But I suppose just generally, in terms of making sure you got coding skills, because it's going to be important in the future, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a lot around data literacy at a larger scale in organisations. Businesses are starting to understand that they need non-data professionals to be data
Mm,
literate, whether that's including the programming element or not.
mm,
But I think there's a massive cultural shift towards entire organisations becoming a lot more data proficient, so that data driven decision making is adopted a lot more. I think one of the biggest challenges a data analytics professional usually has in their career is that handover between themselves and operations. And a lot of that comes down to a lack of data literacy to understand what is it that the data analytics professional are doing. So creating that literacy at the starting point is going to really help these businesses and transform.
I was quite surprised. I was looking through job boards the other week and just like how much it's changed since I was doing it, like last doing it. I mean, even I think it was probably like 5 years ago
Yeah.
in terms of requirements for the job and how many more are now asking for coding skills as part of some of the roles. So it's becoming ever more prevalent, and you can see it change over time, where it's becoming part of the roles. So for particularly for young kids now going through, they've got to understand how to do it to be really competitive for the jobs, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100% agree with that.
And I suppose just on the data side of things, going back to the top of the conversation, is we can all think of it in terms of what a process looks like, and we do process mapping, but it's almost like how do you do data mapping? And I'm thinking in terms of data because that allows you to then do the data decisioning, doesn't it? So I suppose it's just trying to change that thinking around a little bit. And so how have you found the Code Academy in terms of like rollout and adoption?
Yeah, it's been really popular with all the schools that we initially engaged with. I think the initial surprise was the fact that they're wondering where the cost was going to come into it, but because it's a free program, they quickly came on board, and it's been phenomenal to see how much interest we've had. The first school that we were in, when we rolled out the third cohort, we had 67 applicants for 15 spaces. So it's not just the children, it's the parents as well that are starting to take wind of it, encourage their children to go and apply for these courses. So I really think it's going to be an important part of the curriculum.
Yeah, so maybe just give a brief overview. So how many schools are you in now? How long has it been going? What's the scope of it? Where have you been so far?
Yes, I guess to take it a step back even further, the reason I started at the Code Academy was there's three reasons, in fact, two that are commonly talked about and one that I believe isn't as commonly talked about. One, there's a data skills gap. There's a government release paper back in 2021 articulating how many jobs they believed were required in the market, how many jobs will be vacant because there aren't enough professionals in the market. Two, there's a lack of diversity, predominantly gender diversity, but also ethnic and disability diversity within roles. And then the third one, which I feel isn't talked about, is that I believe that there's a scenario where data science and analytical roles can become pay to win. And by that, I mean that because the salaries are booming, because there's so much interest in those roles, and because it's only really a skill set that's required, that skill set can effectively be taught and learnt, and you can put yourself on courses and hearing about phenomenal amounts of money being spent by people going on data analytics courses, and ultimately that can give you that advantage. But obviously, if you don't have the means to put yourself through courses, be put on courses, then that can give you a disadvantage in that environment. So that was the core principles behind the Anumana Code Academy. So we now are in schools. We're in 5 schools in Manchester, focusing on cohorts of 15 children. At least half need to be pupil premium identified, which is government classified disadvantaged. That has scaled from 1 school back in September. So we've done our initial phase of scaling. We've got a partnership with the University of Manchester, and the intent now is to really push it and scale beyond the 5. We've got an aspiration of 20 over the next year, and then beyond that, our vision is, or at least step 1 of our vision is 1,000 disadvantaged children taught Python each year across Greater Manchester. And if we can achieve that, then beyond that, it becomes national and hopefully global.
It's fantastic, and you can see the changing requirements of the workforce and how we're going to need to think about things differently. It certainly plays into all that in terms of the future for the future generations, right?
Well, I think that's it. I think the only way forward with business is towards data and analytics, towards technical proficiency. And if there's currently a gap in skill set now, then that's only going to become resolved if you start really early. We need to blood in the next generation and really get them interested. And I think some of the classes that I've been to, it's interesting to see the shift in children's mindsets now. When we first rolled out the program a year and a half ago, just a couple of years ago, when I asked the children what do they want to do if they wanted to go into use technology, why were they learning Python, why were they learning programming, most of the children said computer games. They wanted to go into computer games design, and that's fair enough. And as a 14, 15-year-old, I'm not surprised by that answer.
Yeah.
Fast forward to a year or in the last 6 months, asked that same question to a different cohort, same age group, and now they're saying web design, they're saying software engineering, they're saying data science. And it's phenomenal how much awareness there is of the opportunities available for them and the breadth of opportunities, and the purpose behind going into programming is very different. And that's over the course of a year, let alone anything further. So I think it's really positive for the economy, for the local community as well.
It's interesting how things change, and I suppose one of my regrets is that back in the late 80s I didn't go into computer game design, because I think that was probably getting the timing right. But looking forward to the next sort of 5 years out from here, what are the areas you think are going to be important, and where do you think we develop from here? Because it's also about the things that are smaller now will be the things that will be much bigger in 5 years' time, rather than the things that are big now. I know we're talking about large language models now, everyone's talking about that, but it's what are the things that you think are going to be important and we've got to learn today in order to get to the future? Where are we going?
I think to a certain extent, for me, what's important is having the accessibility of technology becoming more available for a broader audience. So really ignoring some of the more advanced elements, that's quite obviously there's a lot of excitement there, but being in a position where we're not saying that 90% of businesses are data and analytics literate, we're saying that 90% of businesses are data and analytics literate. I think creating that base level of understanding and when businesses set up, when individuals set up businesses, you know what's important. You need to get an accountant. You probably need a lawyer at some point. You need some sort of HR professional as you're going along. I think having a data professional as one of the early adopters within an organization is something that needs to become a common theme. So I think really getting that foundation established so that it's common practice for data analytics to be a necessity within business rather than a luxury thought after down the line. And then I can't predict the next 6 to 12 months in terms of the analytical advancements, let alone 5 years. Who would have thought a year ago we would be talking about ChatGPT now and generative AI and it's come along phenomenally just in the space of a year. I think what's going to be important, and I guess probably two boring answers to a really interesting question. But for me, I think what's going to be important is really getting the governance right around analytics and really making sure that we do it right. There's a lot of fear around AI and fear what the consequences of it. Obviously, there was that paper that was signed by all the large organizations 6 months ago saying we need to pause until it's felt. But I think I understand why that happened, and there's probably some commercial element I say probably, there was some commercial element in their consideration. But I think rather than pausing advancement, we need to embrace it, but understand how we embrace it in the right way. So I think there's going to be a real importance between developing policy, governance and structure and bringing that into the regulatory environment and having robust regulation around the use of analytics. And I think that's where we need to get to in the next 2 to 5 years to enable advancement.
Yeah, you can see the bun fight starting about data, can't you? Even this week over who's got access to what data. There's lawsuits going left and centre, and so it's again, it all comes down to the data, really, doesn't it? And who owns what versus not. So it's going to be interesting to watch that kind of play out. Exactly. And when you're talking about the chief data officer, one thing I had in my mind is my photo collection. It's like we all have these photo collections on our phones where it's like everything's everywhere.
Yeah.
And if only at the start of it I'd actually organized it and I knew where everything was, and I'd
Yeah.
done it little bit by little bit, it would be just fantastic. I could find everything. And it's almost like that was almost like my analogy for the data officer. If only my data was structured in the right way and I knew where everything was and I could actually use it, then it'd be transformative.
Exactly that, the
Yeah,
benefit of hindsight. I think there's
yeah,
a South Park character called Captain Hindsight. I think that's
yeah,
probably the right sort of role for name for the CDO,
yeah.
effectively.
Yeah. Hemant, thanks very much for making the time. It's
Yeah.
fascinating to hear about what's going on, particularly in the data world and, say, the decision science and the data science elements of it, because often we hear a lot of media talk around some of these exciting things that are like almost like the magic of the end product, but actually it's
Mm.
the, as you say, it's the data, the governance, and making sure you get it right. Actually, underneath the hood is important because that's where it's really going on. So I really appreciate the insight.
No, it's great to talk to you, Chris.
Thanks
Yeah.
very much.
Thanks a lot.